So we are in the midst of a whole series of classes on Franz Rosenzweig and the return to Judaism. We've explored a variety of topics about what does it mean to be a Baal Tshuva, how does Rosenzweig conceive of it, what does it mean to take on mitzvot, how do we view halacha, all of those questions. And last shiur, we turned to the question of Torah and how one relates to Torah. Specifically, last time we looked at the question of what is the truth of Torah. And again, this question of what is Torah, how do we relate to Torah is a very, very important one for Rosenzweig and ultimately for all of us, right? Torah is the center of what it means to be a Jew in many ways. So how we conceive of it is going to be of fundamental importance. Now, as we spoke about last time, for Rosenzweig, when it comes to this question of truth, what is the truth of Torah? It does not correspond to a historical or scientific reality that can be demonstrated or proven. For Rosenzweig, the truth of Torah is something that we experience in our lives, right? It's something we come to know intimately, you might say, through the way that we experience Torah in our lives. For Rosenzweig, the truth of Torah is an existential truth that seizes our very being rather than being something we simply know cognitively, like 2 × 2 = 4. Meaning, if you think that the truths of Torah are cognitive truths that are things that you could just know and memorize, and that's the end of the story, and just affirm or avow, you fundamentally misunderstand what the truths of Torah are about, right? The truths of Torah are things that are supposed to seize you, right? They're supposed to grab your entire being, and they're supposed to fundamentally transform how you live your lives. When we hit upon the truth of Torah for Rosenzweig, we experience it as something solid, something that not only gives our life meaning, but can ultimately bear our life's weight. According to Chazal, and we talked about this last time, right? Sheker, falsehood, is something flimsy. It can basically just be pushed right over, where truth, emes, endures. Truth is something eternal. So that's what we looked at last time. And today, I want to come at this question from a different angle. One of the striking things that Rosenzweig argues is that it's better to approach the Torah as a heretic rather than as a simple believer. Meaning it's better to approach the Torah as if you don't believe in God than to approach the Torah as if it was given from God to the Jewish people at Har Sinai. I know this sounds a little bit crazy, but we have to understand what Rosenzweig means about this, and we'll get there, as you're going to see, through the teachings of Rav Kook as well. So what Rosenzweig means, just to sort of put it simply, isn't so simple. Just because a person says, I believe in God, or I believe the Torah is from heaven, that alone doesn't really tell us very much at all. Belief is not skin deep and can't be limited simply to the words that we use. When we say things like faith, or I believe, or the Torah is true, or the mitzvot are true, right? It's supposed to touch upon something transcendent, meaning, again, it's much deeper than just saying, okay, this is true or not true, right? Because we can say things are true, but that doesn't mean anything unless we can also see how it fundamentally impacts our lives. Human beings are really good at lying. We're really good at lying even when we don't think we're lying, right? So again, to say something that is true for Rosenzweig means we're saying something very, very fundamental about it. And the reason that he thinks maybe it's better to approach the Torah as a heretic is that if you approach the Torah as a believer, it's easy just to sort of think you're taking it in when you're not really taking it in at all. Whereas if you approach it as a heretic, you approach it in a much more discriminating fashion, right? Like you're looking at it very closely and you're deciding what you really like and what you really don't. But before we get to Rosenzweig, as I said, I want to actually start today with looking at Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Kook, one of the great Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. Rav Kook, as you probably know, is a favorite of mine. I have a book coming out in a couple of months, which half of it is dedicated to Rav Kook. And there's actually a lot of very interesting similarities between the thought of Rav Kook and Rosenzweig, and we'll see a little bit of it. We'll see a little bit of it today. what I want to focus on with Rav Kook is that Rav Kook, like Rosenzweig, also recognized that faith isn't something simple, right? Faith isn't black and white. Faith isn't yes or no. And when you reduce faith to that kind of binary thinking, you actually diminish faith in a very, very significant fashion. So when Rav Kook looks out at the early 20th century, at European Jewry, what he sees is most Jews abandoning Yiddishkeit, right? The overwhelming majority of Jews in Europe, when given the opportunity to leave traditional Judaism behind, to embrace the freedoms of modernity, most Jews ran towards it, right? They said, you know what? I want to give up all this traditional stuff and embrace a better life, right? That's what most Jews did. And again, this took many different forms. Secularization, existed in different places in different ways, right? For some, Zionism was a form of secularization, right? Zionism gave Jews the opportunity to still identify very strongly as Jewish, but they could move to the land of Israel, start settling the land, building up the land, and they could leave religious observance behind and still feel very Jewish, right? Jews could come to America, where secularization was very, very easy, right? You could give up Jewish religious life, but still be a Jew and live quite a comfortable life in America. So when Rav Kook is looking out and seeing Jews abandon traditional observance, most Orthodox rabbis looked at this and thought that these Jews were just horrible, right? They're abandoning God, they're abandoning Torah, like spit on them. Like, we have to be the ones who maintain the faith. We have to be the ones who hold on to the truth, and poo-poo all those Jews who are leaving leaving the Torah behind. And to a large extent, they blamed them. They said, they're the ones at fault here, right? We, have to, carry the torch of faith. And for most of traditional Orthodoxy in the early 20th century, right, the lesson they took from watching most Jews abandon observance, abandon faith, was that we have to build a bigger wall between Judaism and the modern world, right? That was the message they took, right? Once you start opening the doors to the modern world, people start running towards it. So what we have to do is build a really big wall, make our community as insular as possible to prevent people from losing faith. I mean, that is basically the general approach of most of Orthodoxy in the early 20th century. However, for Rav Kook, he looks at this very differently. Instead of seeing modernity as something that had to be fought against with tooth and nail, Rav Kook recognizes that the Jews who are giving up observance, giving up faith, they're not the ones to be blamed. Instead, Rav Kook points to two major reasons why he sees Jews abandoning religious life, and this will get to his more complex understanding of faith, and it's certainly one that Rosenzweig shares as well. So why for Rav Kook are most Jews abandoning Torah, abandoning God? So the first reason, which we're not going to focus on, but I'm going to mention it because I think it's a really, really important one, and it's also very interesting, is that Jews are abandoning God because of the moral failings of the Orthodox rabbinate. Rav Kook believes, and he says this in a couple of places, that if the rabbis had been truly moral and religious role models, Jews would have remained within the fold. But because that's not the case, when the Jews are looking around and all the temptations of modernity and all they see are rabbis behaving badly, for lack of a better expression, right? They're just like, why would I want to stay here and be part of this in any way whatsoever? What they see, and again, this has been true in many periods of Jewish history, but often in periods of transition, right? They see rabbis acting corruptly. They see them failing to address the real issues facing the Jewish community. And as a result, Rav Kook argues most Jews are turning away from Yiddishkeit. So that's the first reason. And again, what's fascinating for me about that is simply that Rav Kook, instead of blaming the Jews who are leaving, he looks inward and realizes that the rabbinate has to take responsibility, which is, to me, a profound point, because again, leaders like to always have people to blame, right? They rarely want to take responsibility for their own faults. Now, the second reason, and this is really the important one, why Rav Kook thinks Jews are abandoning religion, abandoning God in the wake of modernity, was because Jews' religious education had failed them. And what I mean by this is that historically, 19th, early 20th century, the religious education that most traditional Orthodox Jews received was a very narrow and backward one that presented a very narrow and backward picture of religious life. And what Rav Kook highlights is that the conception, particularly the theological education, right, the way they're taught to think about God, to think about Torah, to think about mitzvot, Rav Kook sees it as deeply problematic because the primary lens that they're taught is that they have to relate to God through the perspective of yirata onesh, through the perspective of fear of punishment, meaning that a Jew should keep Torah, a Jew should have faith, a Jew should keep halacha, because if not, God is going to punish them, right? That was the central message people were taught. If you don't keep mitzvot, you are a sinner. And I know it sounds simplistic, but there are plenty of people who grew up in my grandparents' generation who went to some form of cheder, some form of religious education. We're like this, and we're talking even 20, 30, 48 years later than Rav Kook, right? Like this is the kind of message that they were taught, right? Like there are many people who grew up in, Orthodox day schools and yeshivas. This was the primary message that they were taught, even though you might think there was supposed to be something more sophisticated going on, right? This sort of simplistic black and white, do it or you're going to be punished. Do it and you'll be rewarded. That was the basic message that most people were taught. And Rav Kook sees this type of theology, this type of religious thinking as being really, really problematic. And he also argues when you look at the Jewish tradition, right, the Jewish tradition pushes against focusing exclusively on fear of punishment, that we should only do things because God's going to punish us or reward us. And in fact, a lot of Jewish thinkers throughout Jewish history think that this is a lesser form of relating to God, because it's ultimately not really about God at all. It's about ensuring one's own welfare by avoiding God's punishment and doing what God wants, so you'll get the so you'll get the reward. In other words, it's really like a narcissistic way of faith, right? You're only doing it to make yourself better. Well, Judaism grants a certain legitimacy to this approach. As a starting point to religious life. I mean, this is kind of like what you teach children, like even when you're parenting, like even when it's not about God, even when you're just trying to teach your children to be human beings in this world. Obviously, you start from this place of, sort of reward and punishment, right? But you can start there, but if you never move beyond that, you have a real big problem. In contrast, Rav Kook argues that the fear a person feels in the presence of God, what we might call yirata ramamut, or sort of a fear of God's awe, a sense of awe, a fear of God's majesty. This has a fundamentally different character than fear of punishment. And grasping God's majesty requires recognizing that however we might think of God, whatever we were taught when we were young, that God exceeds all of these categories and descriptions, and that God ultimately exceeds human understanding, right? We never can put God in a box, right? We can never say, okay, this is what God is and this is what God isn't. And human beings have a profoundly difficult time with that, right? If there's one thing human beings like to do when it comes to God, it's like, as I said, to put God in a box, to say, okay, this is exactly what God is, this is exactly what God wants. Because if you know exactly what God is and exactly what God wants, that kind of gives you the license or the authority to claim and do anything. So what we're going to look at before we go to Rosenzweig is just some citations from one of my favorite essays by Rav Kook about atheism, about Jews who have abandoned God and abandoned faith. And as I said, instead of blaming them, Rav Kook recognizes that maybe they have good reason for this. And he actually goes on to argue that atheism, abandoning God, a lack of faith, might actually be a good thing. So here's what Rav Kook writes. He says, one must always cleanse one's thoughts about God to make sure they are free of the dross of deceptive fantasies, of groundless fear, of evil inclinations, of wants and deficiencies. So the first point Rav Kook makes here is that most people have an incorrect conception of God. And what he means is that we project onto God all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons. We have these fantasies about God, we have these fears of God, these desires of what want God to want, or what we don't want God to want. And the problem with all this is, as I said before, God exceeds whatever categories we want to ascribe to God. And faith in God is ultimately rooted not in things that are finite, right, which is human language, human categories, human adjectives, right? God is rooted in the infinite, that which exceeds all that which exceeds all categories, which means if God is infinite, then faith has to aspire to or touch upon something that is infinite as well. Rav Kook says here, the foundation of religious faith is rooted in the recognition of the greatness and perfection of the infinite. Whatever we conceive of it is insignificant in comparison with what by right we should conceive of it. Right? However we conceive of God, whatever categories or labels we choose to give to God, God is ultimately not any of them, or at least God isn't limited to any of them. And the challenge is that we are taught a particular conception of God, a particular way of thinking about God, when we are young, and we have a very, very hard time moving, beyond that. And again, it's something human. I'm not trying to blame people, but I cannot tell you sometimes when I was dealing with people, people who were incredibly sophisticated and yet would come to me and say things, share things about their beliefs, which were genuine. But there was always a part of me at times when I was a shul rabbi, I was like, wow, that's like, there's a lot more to God than the way you're describing it right now. And I wanted to tell them that. But again, one thing you learn as a rabbi is that it's not your job to try to directly challenge people's, deeply held beliefs. But at the same time, you have a responsibility to try to help people, think in a more, expansive fashion. So Rav Kook goes on. He says, the greatest impediment to the human spirit on reaching maturity results from the fact that the conception of God is crystallized among people in a particular form. Going back to childhood habit and imagination, this is an aspect of the offense of making a graven image, making an idol or a likeness of God, against which we must always be aware, particularly in an epoch of great intellectual enlightenment. So there's a lot going on here in this paragraph, but it opens with a surprising point from Rav Kook, and a really important one. He says, the greatest impediment to the human spirit results from a fixed and childish conception of God, right? Now, there's a lot of things we might say are great impediments to the human spirit. We might point to selfishness, we might point to human cruelty, but we wouldn't necessarily have chosen that it's our conception of God. Yet for Rav Kook, the way we think about God, the way we think about Torah, has a profound effect on the way we look at others and the way that we look at the world. To hold on to that crystallized, fixed notion of God that we had when we were young is, as he says here, is to make an idol out of God, right? When you put God in a box, right, you're essentially, especially a box that you made when you were relatively young, right, like you are making an idol out of God. And this is a tragedy for Rav Kook, especially at a time in modernity when human beings have done so much to reach their intellectual potential, right? So if God is the most important thing in the world, don't we as human beings, as Jews, deserve to have a more sophisticated conception of God than the ideas that we, again, developed when we were kids? So that's, again, all part of the all part of the problem here. But again, moving beyond this isn't so easy. Rav Kook goes on, he says, since the thoughts concerning God and their basic elements are unclear, God's being as conceived by the multitude and even by individuals who should be their leaders is that of a ruthless power, from whom there is no escape and to whom one must necessarily be subservient. Meaning the childish conception of God that most Jews have, and not just most Jews, he says here, but most rabbis have, is that of God as a ruthless power. God is the most powerful thing there is, and if you don't listen to God, you're going to get punished, and if you do listen to God, you're going to get rewarded. But of course, as I said, if this is the only kind of relationship that we can have with God, then two things will happen, right? Number one, a God who is a ruthless power will most likely create believers who act in a similar way, right? Like, this is just a basic psychological point, but it's worth mentioning, right? The things that you identify with, the things that you invest with the greatest meaning in your life, you imitate them. You will be like them, whether you realize it or not. So if God is the most important thing to you, and the God that you conceive of is a ruthless power, then in all likelihood, that is kind of the, the attribute, the persona that you are going to embody as well, particularly rabbis, right? Rabbis are in the position of embodying, for lack of a better expression, I almost hate to say this, right? They are God's representatives, right, here on earth, right? They're going to be like God. People are going to look at them as godlike. And if rabbis conceive of God as a ruthless power, then that's what they're going to ultimately embody. So that's problem number one with all of this. But problem number two, and this is the more relevant for Rav Kook here, is those who are unwilling to submit their autonomy and self-worth to a ruthless God, right? Because they just aren't willing to do that. Then what's going to happen is they're going to leave religion behind. They're going to abandon faith entirely, right? If that's the kind of God that they're going to be presented, they're simply going to want to have no part of it. And this is why Rav Kook goes on to say that atheism has a temporary legitimacy. For it is needed to purge away the aberrations that attach themselves to religious faith because of a deficiency in perception and in divine service. Meaning atheism does something really important, right? Because by people abandoning this childish, almost idolatrous conception of God, this God is a ruthless power, right? We actually have the possibility of maybe then creating a better understanding, a more accurate understanding, a more transcendent understanding of God, right? So atheism actually can do something good because it will force all those rabbis and all those Jews who think they know God but really don't to perhaps recognize that they have to grow. Their understanding has to fundamentally change. Rav Kook goes on, he says, this is its sole function. Existence, meaning atheism's sole function, is to remove the particular images from the speculations concerning God, who is the essence of all life and the source of all authority. Atheism comes to cleanse the improper beliefs of God that many Jews have. That's why this is probably even true today, right? Probably of all religions out there, right? Jews probably have the highest percentage of people who identify as Jewish, but also will openly say they don't believe in God, right? Like, so Rav Kook is saying that there's, as paradoxical as that kind of thing is, right? It's for a reason, because it's ultimately coming to elevate and transform people's misunderstandings of God. And again, the fact that Rav Kook sees atheism as a good thing may very well be one of his most radical teachings, and one of the more radical teachings you'll find said from any rabbi. When Jews don't believe in God, right, as I said, this serves perhaps a constructive role for Judaism, because what they are rejecting is a false conception of God, the God who sits up in heaven and makes demands and throws down lightning bolts, so to speak, right? A God who will punish us if we don't follow every detail of halacha. And if this is what you think the Torah and mitzvot are all about, if you think they can be reduced to this, then maybe it's better off that you don't believe in God at all, right? That's what Rav Kook is saying. And not that it's not just better that you shouldn't believe in it, but that when orthodoxy, when tradition has to confront all these non-believers, it's going to force it to rethink its understanding of God. And then Rav Kook concludes here. He says, when one discovers the stern protest embodied in rebellion and atheism, one finds the element of good inherent in it. It is in truth a general aspect of penitence, of tshuva stirring the heart. He says here that when Jews abandon God, when Jews become atheists, it's not a sign that they are somehow corrupted or they're poor moral character. It's actually a sign that they want to connect with God. But the problem is the God that is presented to them is one simply not worthy of worship, right? That's why they rebel against it. But what they're seeking is a more elevated, a more purified, or a more refined notion of God. And this is true in general. Most acts of rebellion are better often understood as the result of profound frustration, right? The people who are rebelling, they're rebelling because they want more from that which they are subservient to, or that which they worship, or that which they care about, than they are able to get out of it. It doesn't mean we rebel against things that don't live up to our hopes and expectations. But that doesn't mean we don't care about them or that we think that they're worthless. They're not able to be what we want them to be. And that's why we're rebelling against it. But deep down, if they could be what we wanted them to be, right, we would direct our our energy and our faith in them. Atheism will cause Judaism to develop a more elevated conception of God, one that exceeds the categories of how we normally think about God, right? Basically, atheism will force Judaism to grow up. Maybe that's the simplest way to say it for Rav Kook. Instead of thinking about God, as I said, putting God in a box, thinking about God as sort of this simplistic way, or even thinking about God in terms of like, what we think of as more sophisticated, that God is all powerful, or God is all good, or God is all knowing. Even those kinds of attributes often don't really tell us very much at all, or can't even begin to be reconciled with our actual experience of the world, right? If God is all good, then why is the world the way that it is? Even these kinds of adjectives, though an attempt to speak to God's greatness, can easily become empty and tell us very, very little at all. So to summarize, Rav Kook argues the Jews have lost their faith en masse because Jews have an immature understanding of God that they developed when they were young due to poor religious education, poor theology. This kind of religious thinking fixes God in a very rigid way of being, and as I said, one might even say it makes an idol out of God, in which people conceive of God as a ruthless power. Atheism is a response to all this, and atheism will eventually purify faith. People may abandon religious observance, but this abandonment reflects a deeper desire for faith that Rav Kook optimistically feels will ultimately come to fruition. Now, what's fascinating is that one can see a similar dynamic to all of this: faith, atheism, immature understandings of God, more elevated understandings of God, as it relates to Rav Kook's approach to Torah. Rav Kook's approach to the idea of Torah min hashamayim, that the Torah is from heaven, that the Torah is divine. So in one of his other teachings, and again, this is a very radical teaching, he opens by saying that there is heresy that is comparable to faith, and faith that is actually heresy. Meaning there's a emunah that's really kfira, and there's kafira that actually is really emunah, right? It's almost sounds like he's, saying, nonsense here, right? How could the things be their opposite? But what Rav Kook means is that there are Jews out there who claim to be Orthodox, who claim to have emunah, claim to have faith, but in truth, when you look at the content of their faith, of their belief, what they actually believe, it's much closer to heresy. Right? And the same is true in the opposite direction, right? There are Jews out there who appear to be non-believers. If you ask them if they believe in God, they say no. They reject God as maybe implausible, irrational, doesn't make sense. History proves there's no God. But when you look closely at them, you realize there's far more going on than meets the eye. So how does Rav Kook understand this? He says, in what way, right? How is the one who doesn't have faith actually closer to faith, and the one who has faith actually closer to not having faith? So he says a person may admit that the Torah is from heaven. A person may think the Torah came from God. God gave it at Har Sinai to the Jewish people. But the heaven he imagines is so strange that there is no element of true faith in him. So again, to explain what Rav Kook means here, he's saying there are people who are Orthodox. There's people who claim that the Torah is divine. Perhaps they even follow the mitzvot. Perhaps they're careful about halacha, but when you look at how they actually conceive of God, the heaven they imagine, so to speak, it's rather limited. It's rather impoverished, right? It goes back to whatever their conception of God and Torah is. It's pretty childish, and fundamentally not offering the kind of picture that ultimately can enrich and transform one's life. Now, Rav Kook in this text doesn't say exactly what he means when he says that their conception of God or heaven is so strange. But we can extrapolate from what we saw before, right? A person may be Orthodox or say they're Orthodox, but perhaps they think that by doing mitzvot, God's going to reward them. God's going to make their life good. Perhaps they think that by doing mitzvot, that makes them better than other Jews, right? I'll be the good Jew who does mitzvot, and that makes me, better than all those Jews out there who eat treif and intermarry and whatever. They may follow the Torah and even think it's from God, but they ultimately relate to it in a narcissistic fashion, right? They believe in it to the extent that it serves their worldview and makes their life easier for them, right? That's the sum total of their beliefs. All right, and again, there's no small number of Orthodox Jews who think like this. But from Rav Kook's perspective, again, right, it's if you conceive of God as a ruthless power, if you're only in it because it's making your life good, if you're only in it because it's making you feel like you're better than others, then what kind of Torah are you conceiving? What kind of God are you conceiving? What kind of heaven are you conceiving? So Rav Kook goes on to then, of course, describe, well, who are these heretics that are somehow closer to having faith? He says a person can deny that the Torah is from heaven, but his heresy is based only on what he absorbed from the description of the heavens of those whose minds are filled with empty and vain thoughts. And he assumes that the Torah must have a higher source than this, and he begins to find its root in the great spirit of man, steeped in morality and of great wisdom. So this other Jew, right, the non-believing Jew, the heretic, right, he doesn't believe the Torah comes from God, but they have good reason to think this, right? The God that they were taught was childish in a sense. It was a God who wasn't worthy of one putting one's faith and trust in them. Therefore, what does this person do? Well, they may not believe in God, but they still find meaning in the Torah, right? And there are many, many Jews who fit this description, right? They don't see themselves as religious, or maybe they go to a synagogue, but they'll say, I don't really believe in God. But nonetheless, there's still something about the Torah that they find profoundly meaningful, even if they think it was written by human beings, even if they think it's a product of human culture and history. But what's important for Rav Kook is they still see greatness in the Torah. They still see a moral and spiritual vision in the Torah that inspires them, even if they don't think it necessarily comes from God. And this heretical Jew still thinks quite, highly of the Torah. They just don't believe it's divine. And Rav Kook goes on. He says, even though this person did not reach the truth, meaning they didn't reach the truth that the Torah came from God, but nevertheless, their heresy is considered belief, and it becomes increasingly similar to true faith. Right? So for Rav Kook, a rejection of God can be closer to faith. Why is this? Well, in part because the view Rav Kook describes here is one in which human beings are given great respect. Because if you think the Torah has this profound moral and spiritual message, even though it was produced by human beings, that means that you think human beings are capable of producing and living up to a profound moral and spiritual message, right? And this belief, in a sense, captures the deeper meaning of the idea that human beings are created in the image of God. Meaning, if you think human beings have this great inner capacity, this great inner potential to envision great spiritual and moral truths, even if you don't believe in God, that understanding actually is closer to faith than what, like, a lot of traditional believers often think, right? Because if you believe human beings can write the Torah and all of its greatness, that means you understand something holy and true about human potential, right? At a certain point, even though this individual doesn't reach the truth, their faith is still closer to faith than that of a lot of traditional believers. If you're not sure the Torah is divine, but you see true greatness in what the Torah has to teach, then that is closer to true faith than the Orthodox Jew who believes the Torah is from heaven, but the God he believes in is really much closer to Santa Claus, right? The God that they believe in is the one who has a list, or two lists, we'll say. One list who's naughty, everybody who's naughty, one list and everybody who's nice, and God's going to reward accordingly, at the proper time. Meaning, if you can see greatness in the Torah, even if you don't believe in God, that might actually be worth something a heck of a lot more than a rather narrow and childish and cartoonish or idolatrous conception of God that many quote unquote traditional believers often have. And Rav Kook says, in an upside down generation such as this, meaning in his own time, but one that certainly applies to us today, right, we have to look at it this way. We have to look beyond the surface, right? You can't just look at what people say and look at superficially what people do and think that tells you something truly about religious belief. He says, in Torah from heaven is but an example of all elements of faith regarding their outward appearance and their inner essence, which is the essential desired part. What matters is what's internal, like what we really believe. Right? Going back to what Rosenzweig said before, what matters is the truth that seizes our entire being, right? What does not matter are the things that we say. or the things that we do simply because it's going to be good for us, right? A narcissistic view of Torah and God is not a truth that seizes and transforms your being, right? It's something you do simply to ultimately to make yourself, to make yourself feel good. Before we turn to Rosenzweig, I want to just unpack a little bit more why it is that so many people have a hard time moving beyond these rather childish notions of God that we are often, educated in when we are young. And what is it that causes people's understanding of God to crystallize in a particular form? And that's what Rav Kook said earlier, right? The danger is when our conception of God crystallizes into a particular form, it becomes fixed. It becomes rigid. It becomes sort of black and white. Why is it that we have such a strong tendency to make an idol out of God and the Torah, in the sense that we feel we need to give them a fixed and unchanging form? And this is a deep, deep temptation that we as human beings, I think always have. In truth, we have the tendency to turn anyone and anything that exists in a position of importance to us into a caricature of themselves. And why is this? Because if something is really important to us, something's really, really important, it's the kind of thing that gives meaning to your life and purpose to your life, and it's essential for your identity and how you see yourself and how you see others. Well, for those kinds of things, it's much easier to imagine them as fixed and unchanging, rather than allow them to be alive, rather than allow them to potentially change in ways that might be scary or difficult for us. If the things we care about are fixed and unmoving, if we make them into a statue, let's say, then we don't need to be threatened as much by them, because we know what we're going to get from them. We know what they are, and we know what they're not. The more important a thing or a person is to us, the greater the temptation is to do this, because the more important it is, the more difficult it is for us to allow it to change, to be something we have no control over. If something is fixed and rigid, it can provide a consistency that we find comforting. And I think, that's in no small part why people hold on to these rather, simplistic ways of thinking about God, because it does provide a certain stability to their lives. And they don't want to have to interrogate those beliefs in any kind of deep way, because if you play around with how a person thinks about God, right, like that can be deeply, deeply, unsettling. So I want to give you just a more practical example from my own life, and I think it's one we can all relate to, and it comes from my experience, being a shul rabbi. I think we would all agree that synagogues are very important to Jews, right? Synagogues are very important to all of us. It's the place we come to feel part of the Jewish people and to connect to God. Furthermore, synagogues grant us a sense of identity, right, which is very important to us. We introduce ourselves to others by saying, this is the shul I'm a member at. Right? And as all of you know, when I was the rabbi at Cedar Sinai Synagogue, it was a period of tremendous change for our shul. We merged three old, and I hate to say it, dying shuls into one, which was not easy. And what made it often so difficult was the fact that most people who were coming from those three older shuls had a very narrow way of thinking about what their shuls should be like. And it was a way of thinking about their shul that was mostly dependent on the way it had been in the past. And what I saw again and again and again was that the very idea that even small things about their shul could change was extremely hard for people, right? Even the smallest things, right? The menu at Kiddush, right? The way the font used in the weekly, right? Like even the tiniest things could be deeply upsetting to people, because shul meant the world to them, right? Like shul, again, if we want to be clear here, right? Shul in many ways is a representation of God for people, right? Like we project onto synagogues, right? Like all that baggage that we take into our relationship with God. As I said before, the things that are most important to us, the things that are the bedrock of our identity, we want those things to be stable and consistent. We want them to be in a box, and we don't want them to change. But the problem, of course, and this was again part of my day-to-day experience as a rabbi, is that a shul can't be one thing forever. If a shul is meant to be a mikdash ma'at, right, it's what we call a synagogue. We call it like a small base of mikdash, right? It's supposed to be a home for God. Then a shul must have to change. It's going to have to change. It can't be fixed in a single form forever. And if that's true for a shul, right, that a shul is going to have to change, and yet we still want to hold on to fixing a shul in a particular form, then, as we say, kol v'chomer ben beno shel kol v'chomer, all the more so that's the case for God, right? We want God to look a certain fixed, stable, rigid, crystallized way because it brings a certain consistency to our world, and we don't want to have to change that in any way whatsoever. Now, I think with all this, we can now understand Franz Rosenzweig's approach to the Torah. Like Rav Kook, he also understands that faith is subjective. The belief is not dependent on knowledge or any kind of cognitive knowledge, or what we affirm with our lips. It's not just enough to say that you believe these things, but that faith is ultimately dependent on something much, much, much deeper. And in this first quote here I brought from Franz Rosenzweig, he says something very, very similar to Rav Kook, right? He says, the word believing does not mean a dogmatic self-commitment, but a total obligation embracing the entire person. As I keep saying, right, for Rosenzweig, faith, truth, is something that seizes the entirety of your being, right? It's the kind of thing you are willing to stake your life on. And Rosenzweig goes on, he says, in this sense, the heretic too can be a believer, and the orthodox an unbeliever, right? Exactly like Rav Kook, right? If you want to know whether someone's a believer, someone has emunah, somebody has faith, right? It's not a question of what comes out of their mouth. It's a question of the extent to which that truth, as I said, seizes their entire being. And there are many people who are quote unquote orthodox, but the truths that they affirm with the lips, they certainly don't live out with their lives. And there are many people who are not orthodox, that when it comes to the greatest, mitzvot or values or principles in Judaism, these people might not even believe in God, but they believe these truths of Torah and are literally willing to stake their life on them. Just because somebody wears a kippah and keeps strictly kosher doesn't mean we should just assume that they have faith. And under the right circumstances, a heretic, one who doesn't believe in God, Rav Rosenzweig says, could be much more of a believer than the one, as I said, who claims to be orthodox. Why is this? Because faith isn't something you know to be true, like 2 times 2 equals 4. That's the example Rosenzweig gives. We'll see in a moment. As Rosenzweig explains, faith is something that we know not as a cognitive truth, but that we know intimately and commit ourselves to fully. And I read this quote from Rosenzweig last time, but I'll read it again. He says, thus truth ceases to be what is true and becomes that which has to be verified as true. Right? Truth isn't that which the tradition simply tells you to believe, right? Truth, religious faith has to be that which is verified. And by verified, he means that which you, on some level, experience and know from your own life, right? From these most unimportant truths of the type 2 times 2 equals 4, on which people can easily agree. These then lead over to those truths which man is willing to pay, to those he cannot verify in any other way than with the sacrifice of his life. Right? There are simple truths like 2 times 2 equals 4. Those we can all agree on because they're relatively easy truths, right? But the truths that matter, right? The truths that transform our lives, the truths of Torah, right? The truth of faith, the truth of God, right? Those truths can only ultimately be verified by the fact that they give meaning to your life, by the fact that you'd be willing to give up your life for them. And those kinds of truths can't be determined simply because somebody says they believe, right? Those, as I said, are truths that you live in, with every fiber of your being. And you may not even know they're truths for you until the moment in which you're ultimately called to sacrifice for them, right? That's significant, right? You don't really know what you think until you're put in a position to truly be tested, tested by them. I'll give you one more example here. In the next text, Rosenzweig talks about honest knowing, which again is the same idea. What does a truth or faith really mean for us? And again, it's not about something we simply assert that is true because somebody told us, or because the rabbi told me, or the expert told me, or because I read it in a book, right? The honest knowing, Rosenzweig describes in the following way. He says, what does honest knowing mean here? The same thing it always means, that you should make no statements about anything that does not concern you or that is not concerned with you, right? Truth, knowing, faith, it's not about theory. It's just not, right? Truth, knowledge, and faith are things that you have a great concern for and that are concerned with you, right? These are things that matter to you. These are things that have stakes in your life. These are things that you experience. These are things that are important to you, right? Those are the only things we can say that we truly know. He says, without such concern, without such stakes, such investment, even research into 15th century German agriculture would be worthless, right? It doesn't matter if you're learning something that you think is just historical or theoretical. If you're not truly invested in the meaning of it and what it means to you and in your life, then whatever you come to say about it isn't worth a whole lot at the end of the day. And the same applies, he says here, to statements such as God is holy, or even God is, right? If you say these things, but you are not invested in them with the totality of your being, right, then they're really not worth anything. Statements such as God is holy or even God is are as true as our fashionable pronouncements about God's nearness. Meaning, if you don't mean it, if you don't really on some level commit yourself to these beliefs, if you haven't on some level experienced them as true in your own life, then we can't really call it, honest knowledge. Now, how does all this relate to the idea of the Torah being from heaven, that the Torah is divine? And I think this is a really interesting point here. And remember I said before, for Rosenzweig, it may be better to be a heretic. So hopefully now we can start understanding why that might be the case. Because if you're a traditional believer, for lack of a better expression, you believe because you were taught to believe, right? The problem with that is that you might confuse traditional belief, believing what you were taught to believe, as if it was real truth, right? And for Rosenzweig, believing something simply because you were told it can never be real truth. As I said before, truth is something that is verified in your life. Truth is something that you have to, experience in a real way. Truth is something that you have to be willing to sacrifice for. So if you're a heretic, you're not going to confuse yourself into believing that you think certain things are true that aren't necessarily really true, right? So the heretic has an advantage here because they're open to the possibility of belief, maybe, in ways that the believer may never, because the believer already thinks they're there, when in truth, they're nowhere near it. So to continue to flesh this out, I want to use an example that Rosenzweig writes about in relation to Islam. So in several places in the Star of Redemption, Rosenzweig compares, or I should say contrasts, Judaism and Islam. And in this particular quote, which we'll look at, he points out how Islam also understands the Quran as being from heaven. However, Islam's conception of what this means is problematic for Rosenzweig, as you're going to see. And what's important to keep in mind here is that while Rosenzweig often criticizes Islam in the Star of Redemption, you have to keep in mind two things. Number one, his conception of Islam is never totally accurate. I mean, there are elements of his critique of Islam that are true, but what's more important is that he often uses Islam as a way of representing beliefs of Judaism that he actually wants to reject. So you're going to see here, he describes and criticizes Islam, but what he also describes and criticizes here could very well be beliefs that you will find in Judaism as well, especially orthodoxy about the Torah. So here's what he says. He says, in Islam, revelation is not a living event between God and man, a process into which God himself enters to the point of completely denying himself, right? Islam, according to Rosenzweig, does not have a proper conception of revelation. There is no real encounter between man and God in Islam for Rosenzweig, according to Rosenzweig. Again, I don't want to debate whether this is actually true or not, but this is the claim that he makes, and you'll see why this is ultimately significant. So if there's no true revelation between God and human beings in Islam, then how do we understand the Quran, right? According to Islam, right, Muhammad, their greatest prophet, similar, our version of Moshe, so to speak, right? He has a prophecy from God, and that's how the Quran emerges. So how could Rosenzweig say that Islam doesn't have a belief in revelation? So here's how he explains it. He says, in Islam, revelation is a gift freely set down, a gift that God places into the man's hands. One can see it like a sign in revelation that is here from the very beginning, that which in faith, even for his own consciousness, is only gradual and never completely finished, a book. So his criticism of Islam is that Islam imagines the Quran as basically being dropped from the heavens, right? And this isn't that far off from the way Islam actually understands it, but it's as if that when God gave Muhammad the prophecy of the Quran, it was as if God literally just like dropped the book out of the heavens. And the reason this isn't maybe so shocking is that there are plenty of people who certainly think that this is the Jewish conception of revelation as well, right? That God basically dictated over to Moshe Rabbeinu the Torah, and Moshe just basically recorded it down, and that's it. So the problem with this is it's a profoundly one-sided nature of revelation, right? It's basically God just giving over and the human being as the receiver. In fact, there's no real relationship there, right? If God just drops a book from heaven, right, according to Islam, then it's not even like God is speaking really to human beings. There's no conversation, right? There's no dialogue, right? One of the striking features about the Torah is the fact that God talks to Moses and Moses talks back to God. That God tells Moses to do things and Moses disagrees with God. That Moses even argues with God. But in truth, even for many Jews, right, the conception of Torah min hashamayim is that God dropped a book down from heaven, and it's a divine book, and we have to follow every word that's inside of it, which is basically what Rosenzweig is saying here about Islam, but that this conception really misunderstands what the relationship between, I'll say, God and the Jewish people is really all about. He continues, he says, the first word of revelation to Muhammad is read, right, that the opening of the Quran starts with the words read, right? It's like the book's here, just start reading it, guys. He is shown the page of a book. It is a book that the archangel brings down to him from the heaven in the night of revelation. And then Rosenzweig goes on to contrast Islam with Judaism. For Judaism, older and holier than the written word is the oral teaching, right? That the Torah is a dialogue between God and the Jewish people, right? Even though it crystallizes or it contains or the finalized revelation between God and the Jewish people is very much a conversation, right? Like before things were written down in the book, right, there was dialogue, there was discussion, and there continues to be dialogue and ongoing discussion in relation to the book's meaning, in relation to every meaning of every single word and letter in the Torah. And he goes on also to compare it to Christianity, and Jesus did not leave a single written word for his followers. Islam is a religion of the book from the first moment, right? The book is dropped from heaven. God tells Muslims read, and it's basically submit and obey, right? That's the perception that's being presented. The book sent down from heaven. Can there be any greater distortion of the notion of God himself descending, giving himself to man, of surrendering to him? He is enthroned in his highest heaven and gives to man a book, right? So what I find fascinating about Rosenzweig's description here of Islam in the Quran is, I said before, it matches so closely to what I would say are maybe not the most proper understandings of Torah and revelation, right? In many ways, what Rosenzweig is describing here is exactly that childish and problematic notion of God that so many Jews rejected over a century ago. But when you have a conception of Torah min hashamayim that is sort of this black and white simplistic way, you are fundamentally missing something essential about what the Torah really represents. And how the Torah is in many ways best understood as a partnership between God and the Jewish people, even if one thinks that it was all given by God to the Jewish people at Har Sinai, that you can't take away, right, the human dimension to Torah, right? I'll just point out, we had Parshat Yitro last week, right? The first luchot that Moshe receives, they are the tablets that were made by God. So when Moshe brings those luchot down the mountain later on, right, he sees the Jewish people worshiping an idol, and Moshe smashes those divine luchot. Because in truth, those divine luchot can't really exist in this world. Moshe goes up the mountain a second time. Moshe has to make his own luchot, right? Human-made luchot. They are the ones upon which the Ten Commandments are inscribed. It's those luchot that are brought down and placed in the Aron, right? In the ark, right? And I think that says something very fundamental, regardless of how we conceive of Revelation or Torah Shemayim, that at the end of the day, the Torah in its final form is on some level a partnership between God and human beings. But the conception of Torah Shemayim that's often put out there is one that is deeply hierarchical and ultimately demands subservience from human beings, right? It's one in which God is a ruthless power. God is up in heaven. God is all powerful. God tells us exactly what to do, and we are supposed to submit, right? That's how we relate to God, and that's how we relate ultimately to God's revelation, right? So for Rosenzweig, this is the conception that we need to run away from entirely, because it distorts God, and it distorts the Torah, and it distorts what Revelation is ultimately all about here. He goes on to say, and this is from an important essay of his, which describes his own philosophy of translating the Bible. He says, for the voice of the Bible is not to be enclosed in any space, not in the inner sanctum of a church, not in the linguistic sanctum of a people, not in the circle of the heavenly images moving above a nation's sky, right? You can't put Torah in a box. You can't put God in a box. But if you try to put Torah in a box, right, the voice of God that is within Torah is ultimately going to break out of that, right? You can't give Torah a set of fixed, rigid, black and white meanings and think that that is something that is possible, something that can ultimately endure. Rather, he goes on, you can't, however you imagine heaven, however you imagine God, however you imagine Torah, if you keep it narrow and fixed and rigid, you are doing damage to them. And we know this. There's nothing worse than treating the people we love in a black and white way, right? Treating them as if they can only be this and they can't be that. Because the moment we do that to the people we love, we're basically doing violence to them. And as is the case with the people we love, Rosenzweig says here as well, right? The voice of God within Torah seeks again and again to resound from the outside, from outside this church, this people, this heaven, right? The voice of God will ultimately break through, because the voice of God that is in Torah is revelation, right? It's something real. It's something true. It's the encounter between God and human beings, and that can never be contained forever. That can never be put in a box for eternity. It will eventually break out. It does not keep its sound from echoing in this or that restricted space, but it wants itself to remain free, right? Don't make an idol out of it. It's going to seek freedom. If somewhere it has become a familiar, customary possession, it must again and anew, as a foreign and unfamiliar sound, stir up the complacent satedness of its alleged possessor from the outside. Meaning, the moment you think you know what Torah is, right? That's the moment where you have to be open to the possibility that it can also be something else. And that the meaning of Torah is always going to be ultimately renewed, right? We say about Torah that there are shivim panim l'Torah. There are 70 interpretations of every word or every verse. The Rambam famously says in the Moreh Nevuchim, right, the gates of interpretation are always open with regard to the Torah. But if you make an idol out of the Torah, you're preventing that, right? The fact that the Torah is divine means that it is open always to interpretation and to new meaning. And the moment you close off the possibility of interpretation, the possibility of new meaning, that is the moment when you make an idol out of the Torah. And unfortunately, for many Orthodox Jews, that's what Torah Shemayim means to them. It means the Torah was given by God to the Jewish people. He threw it out of heaven to Moshe. It has all these mitzvot you have to do. And the meaning of those mitzvot, the meaning of Torah is fixed by the tradition, and it's forever unchanging, right? It's eternal. It's what my rabbi says. It's what his rabbi says. It's what his rabbi's rabbi said, and that's the way it's always going to be. Right, like that's the conception that's out there of Torah Shemayim, and that is a deeply problematic conception for Rosenzweig. So I want to wrap up just by playing out a little bit more how Rosenzweig understands, as I said before, this idea that it's almost better to be a heretic when one approaches the Torah. And here's how he describes it. And this part of the essay is also tying into the shift in Protestant beliefs after Luther as it relates to scripture and revelation and modernity. And we're not going to unpack all of it, but there's a broader context to what he's speaking about here. But he recognizes that with modernity, Rosenzweig recognizes this, that there becomes a major shift because we can no longer say about religious truths simply that they are because the tradition told us. We can say it, but we also can't prove it, which means on some level that these are truths that we inherit, but until we feel them in our kishkas, until we know them to be true because they've been verified in our lives, then they are always to a certain extent tentative and uncertain. So here's what he says. He says, the man who seeks to make a positive statement now makes it on his own. You no longer can just speak tradition and say that is unconditional truth, absolute truth, right? Modernity prevents us from ever really being able to do that. Though there may be many to join his confession, there may be a lot of people who agree with you, he does not see them, and the individual voices do not join in chorus. And yet what he has to say, if it is shaped word by word from genuine experience and perception, is not at all subjective, right? At the end of the day, when it comes to religious truth, we have to speak them and believe them on our own, right? Even if there's other people who say them, the fact that somebody else says it's true, right? It doesn't mean it can automatically be true for me, right? But when we come to an understanding of truth on our own, right, that doesn't mean that it is subjective. And the so-called psychology of religion, that favorite study of today's scholarly Chelmites, who with Chelmish earnestness disassembled this telescope in the hope of finding the stars among the parts, simply cannot make sense of such a man. Right, so he's making an interesting metaphor here. He's saying people that question faith is real because it is a faith that people came to from their own truth within their life. If people question that kind of faith is real, they're like the people of Chelm. Right? Like they're like the people of Chelm who open up the telescope to try to find the stars inside. Right? Just because you can see stars through a telescope doesn't mean the stars are in there, right? The stars are ultimately somewhere else, right? The telescope just helps you connect and see the stars. And the same is true with faith, right? Just because faith is found within a person doesn't mean it comes from the person, right? It ultimately is an expression of something far beyond that person, just as the stars that you see in a telescope, as I said, are an expression of something far beyond the actual physical telescope. He goes on, he says, this man is no believer, but no unbeliever either as well. Meaning to be a modern person means to live with a certain amount of doubt, but also to live with the possibility of belief, right? He is then nothing, but he is alive, right? Because if you're willing to have both faith and doubt, that means life is alive for you, right? If you look at the Torah, and you want to believe that it's from God, but there are pieces of it that you don't understand. There are pieces of it that you feel couldn't ever be from God, right? Like if that's the perception that you bring from the Torah and you can be honest about that, that means that there's something about you that is alive. Because if you just pretend, well, the Torah came from God, every word of it must be true, and I simply have to accept it, and that's the end of the story, right? Then there's something about you which has become deadened, right? Like there's something inside you that has been lost because of this. Better, he has neither belief nor unbelief, but belief and unbelief happen to him, right? Both belief and unbelief are possibilities, right? Because you're not ruling anything fundamentally out. Yeah, you're open to the possibility that things can be true. And again, here, when I say that it's better to approach the Torah as a heretic, let me be a little bit more clear. It's better to approach the Torah as a heretic who is open to the possibility of belief, right? If you're a heretic who just will never under any circumstances accept God or the possibility of God, then that's not necessarily a helpful way to look at Torah. But if you are a heretic who is at least open to the possibility of belief, that it could happen at some point in some day, then that is actually an advantage. Because when that moment comes, it can actually be real for you. His only obligation is not to run away from what happens. So like I said, when that moment comes, you're there, that you're ready for it. Or as Rosenzweig would say, you can say Hineni. You can say, here I am, when you hear God calling to you. And once it has happened, to pay it heed. Like to not just say, wow, that was fascinating, but when you have that revelatory moment, that you're able to hold on to it, that maybe you're even able to build the rest of your life around it. Both of these sound easy if we are far from the shot, but they are difficult, and probably no one alive is consistently. indeed has accomplished them more than a few times altogether, right? Those moments where we can be open to the possibility of true belief, of true faith, of hearing God's call, of knowing what the Torah says is true, has been true, and will always be true, right? Those moments are not many. As he says here, they only happen a few times to us, but we have to be open to them because it's those moments upon which real faith is ultimately built. He goes on, he says, a person leading such a life can bring to the Bible only a readiness, both disbelief and both belief and for unbelief, right? Not a circumscribable belief that he finds the Bible confirming, meaning it's better to approach the Torah as a heretic, or at least somebody that is aware they don't believe all of it, than to approach it as just affirming the tradition and therefore finding in the Torah whatever you think you're ultimately going to find in it. Right? One of the fundamental points for Rosenzweig, and we're going to touch upon this more next time, is that revelation is always an encounter with the unknown. It's always finding something you didn't expect, right? Because if all you find is what you're looking for, then that's not revelation, right? Like to look in the Torah and find what you always thought you're looking for is basically to make the Torah into one of two things. Either it's to make the Torah into a mirror so that you find in it all your own beliefs, or it's to make the Torah into an idol so that you know what it's going to say in it before you even open it up. He continues, he says, everything can become credible for this person when they look at the Torah, even the incredible, if they're open to the possibility of the impossible. What is believable is for him not interspersed within what is unbelievable. Rather, and this is the metaphor we'll end with, he says, as a spotlight brings one sector of the landscape out of darkness, then another, then is dimmed, so for this person, the days of his life illuminate Scripture and let him see sometimes amidst Scripture's human traits also what is more than human. So he says here that we have to look at Torah, and he uses the metaphor as a spotlight, right? We come to the Torah, we believe, we don't believe, hopefully it's some mix, right? If it's all belief, then nothing real can ever happen to us. And if it's all disbelief, right, then again, nothing real can ever happen to us. But if we come to the Torah with disbelief and at least open to the possibility of belief, then there's the possibility for a real encounter with God to take place. And the metaphor he uses here is a spotlight, right? We take our spotlight and we shine it on a particular piece of the Torah. And we look at that piece and we try to see whether it can come to life for us. Sometimes we look at that piece and all we see are things that we can't understand, or all that we are things that we only feel are human. But by focusing our light, our spotlight on that piece of Torah, it at least opens us to the possibility that there is something much deeper there. And he goes on, he says, today here, tomorrow there, but with today's event implying no guarantee of tomorrow's. Yet everywhere, these human traits can, in the light of a lived day, become transparent so that suddenly they are written into the center of his own heart. Like those things we look at Torah and don't really feel are truly godly and divine in the way they transform our life. Will be days, there will be moments where we shine the light on them and we'll see something truly, truly profound there. There'll be those moments where we'll look at Torah and we'll feel how, as he says here, it is written onto our heart. That's what God tells us to do in the Torah. The Torah should be written onto your heart. Well, guess what? You cannot have the Torah written onto your heart if you just say you believe it because that's what you are taught, right? For the Torah to be written on your heart, right, it has to be something, as I said, that you feel in your kishkas, something that seizes the entirety of your being. I'll conclude. He says, not everything in Scripture belongs to him, not today and not ever, but he knows that he belongs to all of it, right? Not in any given moment can we always feel that all of Torah is divine for us, that all of Torah makes a divine claim on us, that all of Torah is revelation, that all of Torah is God's voice speaking to us. He says, not today and not ever, but nevertheless, all of Torah belongs to us. He knows that he belongs to all of it, right? That the potential for divine revelation is all there. He says this readiness and this readiness alone is, as applies to Scripture, his belief, right? That the real foundation of faith for Rosenzweig is the belief and the possibility of belief, right? It's the belief that the Torah can be divine that is true faith for Rosenzweig. And again, we can't take it in its entirety, right? Like there are many moments in which I look at things in Torah and I just kind of dismiss it out of hand, that I don't feel it like, really speaking to me or really making demands on me. But there are also moments where I shine my spotlight on a particular piece of Torah. And again, this is the experience I've talked about before, Parshat Shavua, right? Every week we come to a new piece of Torah for the first time and for the 50th or 100th time. But that possibility of coming to Torah again, to shining our light on a new part of Torah, and looking at it deeply and closely and struggling with it and trying to understand it, that effort always brings the possibility of hearing God's call, of experiencing it as divine revelation, and recognizing, right, the possibility that at least in that moment, for that pasuk, Torah mina shamayim, right, that the Torah ultimately comes from God and is from heaven.